I've lived in Mexico City for a little over a year and 3 months over the course of 3 different adventures in the city. Once in 2018 for just a month, then again in early 2019 for 2 months, and finally from mid-2020 to mid-2021 for an entire year. Each adventure presented new discoveries, realities, and snapshots from living in Mexico City. The first part of this video is my reality after living in Mexico City for just 1 month in 2018, while the second part is after living in Mexico City from mid-2020 to the end of 2020. So let's see what 2018 Leo thought about this wonderful place called Mexico City. Alright, what's up? It's Leonidas here, coming in from Mexico City. I have been here now almost 1 full month. Initially I arrived from Puerto Vallarta, and upon leaving the airport, everyone that was outside the airport was basically calling for an Uber. So everyone was using the Uber application. Anyways, I arrived in the center, which is the historical center, and there I stayed in a hostel for about $20 a night for a private room. And in the private room, all you get is a bed and a chair and a small table, but it was enough to basically explore the center of the city. And after that, I decided not to stay in a tiny room, rented a few hotels, and now I'm staying in an apartment close to the center, but not too close, because Mexico City is huge. It's around 21 million people, and things to do here. There are a lot of museums. Apparently, Mexico City is the city with the second most number of museums in the world. The first one, I think, was France. I could be wrong, but it is the second one with the most number of museums to see in the world. Plenty of history. One of my most favorite things to see here has been the Museo de Antropología, which is the Anthropology Museum, which goes through the history of the indigenous populations that lived in the Mexican state. And basically it covers the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, all the other indigenous populations that lived here, and their extensive history and construction and everything that they basically put up, their culture, their trade, economy, war, religion. And it's really interesting, really fascinating to basically discover a world that evolved outside of the old world. So outside of the Christianized, Islamicized Egyptians, outside of that world, basically this was a totally unique world in its own that existed for several thousand years before it was ultimately conquered and destroyed by the colonialism of the time. Okay, so when the Spanish came here, they basically just destroyed the entire religion, culture for the sake of exploitation. There's really a lot of things to do in Mexico and around Mexico City as well. I also visited a city called Coyoacán, which apparently the people believe it has something to do with the coyotes that once existed there, even before the indigenous populations were there, because when the indigenous populations were there were no coyotes even then, according to Wikipedia. If you go further south, you hit a city called Tepoztlan, which has a really cool pyramid in the hills, which I didn't get to visit because before that I was in Coyoacán and didn't have enough time to climb up because at that point it was already closed. Another interesting thing to see here is Teotihuacan, which is a giant pyramid complex. There's about 2 massive pyramids that were built about 2,000 years ago. A little bit less than 2,000 years ago for the sake of religion, empire of the indigenous populations of the time. When arriving there, one thing I noticed is that there's not a lot of information in English. Either you get yourself a guide or you do what I did, which is basically read the information from Wikipedia and other sources online for historical information and context, because otherwise there's a lot of these cities that you go to and a lot of these historical things that you'll see and there's no context for them. They're just objects that exist. Another interesting thing is I rented a car for several days here in Mexico City, and driving in Mexico City is crazy. No one respects the rules of driving. Basically, it's really kind of dangerous driving anywhere. Some people will drive into you when you're walking across the street, but then again, all the Mexicans also just cross the street, even if it's a red light, so there's no right of way either way. Driving is a little bit dangerous. Sometimes you'll see food stalls all over the place. The city itself is not contained outside of the historical center, which is called the Zócalo, which is this big flag with a giant church. Outside of that, basically is just progression of cities, which just expanded all the way through the 19th and 20th century. One last interesting thing I want to point out, the entire city that you see actually used to be a giant lake. The entire city outgrew the lake, and basically there's no more lake. Okay, so everything you see around should have been a lake at one point in time, about 550 years ago, but then the Spanish came and they decimated the city, then flooding occurred, then technology allowed the populations to prevent the flooding, and they would plug up the dams, and then this would prevent any more water from entering the city. And then ultimately they built up a tunnel system to prevent the flooding. That was one of the fascinating things to see here in Mexico City, because when you're driving around, there is no water anywhere to be found. Yet when you look at a map of the city 500 years ago, during the indigenous time, it's surrounded by a massive, massive lake. And yeah, it's a massive city. Driving from one end to the other can take anywhere from 1 hour to about 2 hours, depending on traffic. And there's no grid-like structure. There's very limited grid-like structure that you would see in North American cities, like Chicago or Toronto. What up? Leonidas here, coming in from Mexico City. And behind me is the Altar de la Patria, which is the fatherhood or the fatherland altar. I've actually been living in Mexico City 3 times, and in this adventure, I've been living here for 6 months. So before that, I was doing 2 months, and before that, I was doing 1 more month. So in total, I would say that's about 9 months in Mexico City. I've seen quite an extensive amount of Mexico City, as well as some parts outside of Mexico City too. Number one, some quick history. Mexico City was previously called Tenochtitlan about 500 years ago, about 450 years ago. And what happened was there's a guy, his name was Hernán Cortés. He came to Mexico. He actually wanted to discover gold, but in the process, he discovered Mexico City. And in the process of discovering Mexico City, he actually decided to conquer it. And even though this was illegal at the time, he wasn't permitted by the Spanish crown to conquer Mexico City, which is once again Tenochtitlan. He did it anyway, and when he did finally manage to conquer Tenochtitlan, unfortunately he ended up destroying it. So his mission was to give Tenochtitlan as a present to the King of Spain, but he destroyed most of it in the process of conquering it. So instead of just leaving it as is, he ended up enslaving the indigenous people, and by enslaving them, he told them to take all the temples apart, everything that existed previously in Tenochtitlan, completely deconstruct it, completely take it apart, and reconstruct it as a new city. So if you go to the center of the city, there's this big church called the Catedral de Ciudad de Mexico. It's pretty much built using the stones of the previous temples that existed here in Mexico City. But if you go right next to it as well, there's the ancient ruins of another temple that existed here as well. Let's get to living here. Number one, right now I live in an area called Roma Norte, and Roma Norte is among a few of the areas that are considered more of the fancy, more of the safer regions to live in Mexico City. These safer regions include Roma Norte, Roma Sur, so actually you can just group them together. Then we also have an area called Polanco, and we also have an area called Condesa. So those areas are generally the central upscale regions to live in, but Mexico City is a city of 21 million people, and it's absolutely enormous. Those 3 areas that I just described to you are actually quite small in respect to the entire city. There's also the Centro Histórico, which is the old historic center of Mexico City. That's where you have these big imperial buildings from the colonial eras of Mexico when it was still dominated by the Spanish. And while technically it is kind of falling apart, you can actually walk around quite a big portion of it. The area itself is generally kind of in disrepair. At the same time, it has some of the much older colonial architecture that has been existing there since Hernán Cortés himself came and decided to conquer the entire city. So the very, very center of Mexico City is called the Zócalo. And that's where the old school temple, that's where the old school church is located. If you venture a little bit out of the center, if you go towards the northeast, you'll start to venture into this big market area. And even though it looks a little bit ghetto, it is relatively safe speaking. So especially in the daytime, you can walk around in these market areas, which are called tianguis, right? So it's just a Nahuatl word for a market. You can walk around. It's a massive area, and you can buy yourself some cheap, fake, brand name clothing. So from Puma, Nike, Adidas, all this stuff, but they're obviously fake. If you go from the Zócalo towards the west, you'll encounter the Bellas Artes, which is this very, very beautiful building, and it was dedicated to Beethoven, who was a German composer for music. So in the center, there's more than 10 or 15 churches, very old, very historical, that were built using the foundations of the old Tenochtitlan, the Aztec city. And you can go inside it for completely free. There's very beautiful paintings inside. There's very beautiful Catholic style decorations and constructions inside. Very, very nice. Now, if you go south of the center, let's say about 20 minutes by Uber, you'll enter the town of Coyoacán. Now, Coyoacán is now part of Mexico City, but previously it was its own individual town. And within this little town, you could consider it a pueblo mágico because it has a more old school architecture. In this little area, you would have a little bit more of shopping, a little bit more of, and in the same area of Coyoacán, you would have the Museum for Frida Kahlo, which is this famous painter from about 90 years ago, as well as the house of Leon Trotsky, this exile from the communist system that was exiled by Stalin from Russia in the 1930s. So there's these two very nice museums, along with the area of Coyoacán, which is this pueblo mágico within Mexico City. Moving back to the area of Polanco. So Polanco is generally considered the upscale fancy area of Mexico City. It has a more of a fancy LA vibe, Los Angeles vibe, or if you've ever been to Buenos Aires, it kind of reminds me of Buenos Aires because it has this mixture of fancy versus a little bit of colonial to it. And there you can have tons and tons of restaurants. So personally, I'm a vegan and everything that I eat has no chicken, no beef, no pork, no cheese, nothing milk-based. Mexico City is amazing for being vegan. There's at least a minimum of 30 different restaurants for being vegan here in Mexico City. And the trend for being vegan is moving up very quickly. You can get yourself some Impossible Foods meat. You can get yourself some Beyond Meat, as well. You can get yourself some ice cream that is vegan as well. So lactose-free, just full of sugar, obviously. And other than that, if you're not vegan, there's the typical tacos from at least 10 different parts of the cow, at least 10 different parts of the pig, at least 3 different parts of the chicken. So they take every part of the animal and they chop it up and you can get the tacos. There's also the tostadas con marisco, which is like a crunchy taco. So the taco is typically this flat bread, circular flat bread. And on top of it, you would have the marisco, which is the shrimp or tuna, for example. That used to be my favorite food. And there's this one place in Coyoacán where you can get these tostadas con seafood on top. Amazing, incredible. I can't eat them now, but if you are into that kind of food, super recommended. There's also the Café de Olla. So Café de Olla is actually just a cafe. It's very sweet because they add a lot of sugar into it, and then they add cinnamon. It gives us this very, very unique, very interesting taste. When I go out, I don't typically look to drink a coffee, but if I do have a coffee, if I have no other option, then I will go look for a Café de Olla because I love sweet coffee and I love the taste of sweet coffee with cinnamon. So that's a Café de Olla. The translation for it is cafe in a pot. So it comes in this Aztec style ceramic cup that you can get it in. So Mexico City has a few volcanoes around it. There's the Nevada de Toluca, which is actually about 2 hours away from Mexico City. And then there's the 2 volcanoes that are much closer to Mexico City. One of them is called Popocatépetl. So the other volcano, I don't quite remember the name of, but if you're really adventurous, if you really want some nature hikes, you can climb into the volcanoes. Actually, there's some trails going into the volcanoes. Very cool, very awesome. I've passed through with a car on my way to another town on the east side of Mexico City called Puebla. But in the process of going there, I went through the volcanoes. So there's like 2 volcanoes, you can pass right through them. And the view is amazing. More inside the city of Mexico City, there's tons and tons of nature. Even though you're in Mexico City and there's these big parks, for example, behind this Altar de la Patria, there's this park called Bosque de Chapultepec, which means the forest of Chapultepec. It's this massive, massive park. I think it's just a little bit bigger than the Central Park in New York. It's not as beautiful as Central Park in New York, and it actually is divided into 2 parts. There's one section of it, it's quite massive, and then if you cross the highway, you enter the second section of it, which is even more massive. It's about 150% more massive, and you can walk around. Marijuana is actually legal now in Mexico City, and you can walk around these parks. No one's going to bother you. As well, there's tons and tons of things to buy, like lots of souvenirs. In every little area you go of Mexico City, there's a taco place, there's a place to buy yourself some Doritos, there's some place to buy yourself some drinks, there's toilets you can go everywhere that cost 25 cents US. As far as the people are concerned here, the main language is going to be Spanish. So if you don't speak Spanish, I really recommend you at least get yourself some basic lessons, because 90% of the people only speak Spanish. Maybe 10%, maybe even 5% of the people speak English. Even that, it would be like 9% of those of that section that do speak English would speak fluent English. So for the majority of it, you should learn up some basic Spanish. Generally speaking, the people are super friendly. If you're a foreigner, for the most part, you would be like a unicorn. There's a little bit of interest at where you're from, what you're doing here, why you decided to come to Mexico. But also, even if you do come here, you can walk around. No one's going to come up to you and try to take a million photos of you. I had this experience in India, for example, where I walked around, and in the beginning, it was very interesting. What you treated like a little bit of a celebrity where people took photos, but then generally over time, it became really frustrating. Here in Mexico, no one cares. No one's going to come up to you to take a photo with you unless you're someone famous. But otherwise, no one's going to care to come up to you and start talking to you unless you make perhaps the initiative to speak with them. Or perhaps in the Ubers, you can speak with the taxi driver in the Uber and you can actually learn about them. So another thing is, instead of them asking about you, learn about the culture here in Mexico. It's very fascinating. I absolutely love the culture in Mexico. There's so many things you can do here. In general, you have volcanoes, you have deserts, you have jungles, you have forests, you have cenotes, which is these underground caverns for fresh water, like more in the areas of Cancun in the eastern part of Mexico. You have temples, you have pueblos mágicos, which is these old colonial villages, these old colonial towns in Mexico. Absolutely amazing. The history in every single town is very deep, very profound. There's even actually, surprisingly, there's a Russian church in Mexico. So I'm born in Russia, in the USSR, or the URSS, and there is a Russian church here, but the majority are Catholic churches here, and then you also have the Protestant churches as well. Other things, Ubers, super cheap, super inexpensive. Getting from one location to another is like $7 US. From one location, traveling about 30 minutes is going to cost you maybe $10. From the airports to the center of the city is going to cost you maybe $5. It's super inexpensive. It's one of the great things about here in Mexico City is that the Ubers are super inexpensive. Also, you have Uber Eats. You have every single app that you have in the US, in Europe, in Canada. You have them here as well because it's a very technologically developed city. But you also do have your ghetto areas. For example, some areas that you might hear of are areas called Tepito. Apparently, it's a ghetto area, a little bit dangerous, but for the most part, it's just a market. It's just this massive, massive market. You can go there to buy knockoff things, fake brand names, but it's an area that generally you don't go there unless you go there with Mexican friends. So I managed to go there with several of my Mexican colleagues that I practice boxing with, and we went there and they took me around, and it was super cool, super safe, no problem. Some bad parts of Mexico, try not to break any rules because there is corruption here in Mexico, and generally if you do have to deal with the police, you might have to pay them off. So it's one of those darker elements of Mexico. Not something you would have to do in Canada, for example, not something you might have to do in certain cities in the US. You won't have to pay anyone off, but it did happen to me here in Mexico, where in Parque Mexico, I entered a fountain area that had a little fence around it, and then the two police officers came to me and they essentially tried to make me bribe them to make them go away. They wanted me to pay them about $100 to make them go away. Now, I pretended that I didn't speak Spanish, but in reality, I knew exactly what they wanted as soon as they came to me. So try not to get into situations where you have to bribe anyone, especially if you don't speak any Spanish, because they will take advantage of you. In any direction that you go, let's say you take an hour bus or 2 hours bus in any direction, there's something very cool to see. So for example, in the south, if you travel south of Mexico City, you have the Pueblo Mágico of Tepoztlan. Tepoztlan is this colonial town that was previously a village for the Aztecs, or one of the Aztec colonies in the past. It's a very nice place to go. You can climb up into the mountains. I actually climbed up all the way to the very top because the temple at the top was closed, but for the most part, you can actually climb up even further up, and it's a very cool view of the entire city. And you can actually go across onto the other side and enter this town called San Juan. And then as well, if you take a bus about 3 hours to the southwest of Mexico City, there's a town called Taxco. It's a Pueblo Mágico, once again, magical village, built on the side of a hill. Very cool, highly recommended. Once again, in any direction that you go outside of Mexico City, you will discover something really cool, really wonderful, either temples, either villages, mountains, volcanoes, everything. You have it here. There's a location as well in Mexico City called San Angel. It's a very hipster slash hippie slash super artistic place with tons of coffee shops, tons of places to get yourself some souvenirs as well. And as far as living in Mexico City, so I super recommend coming to check out Mexico City for at least a month, because there's so much stuff to visit here, so many things to do here, that there's no way you're going to be able to accomplish them in 3 or 4 days, not even 1 week. But generally speaking, the place that I do really recommend living would be either Condesa or Roma Norte. So these places have more accessible areas as far as restaurants, as far as bars, as far as coffee shops. Everywhere else is either going to be maybe too ghetto for you, or might not have enough things to entertain yourself within walking distance. Now, as far as safety is concerned, in Mexico City, I have never had any problems here in Mexico City as far as any violent situations, but there is the probability of being scammed in Mexico City. So the first time I decided to live in Mexico City, I was scammed. Someone said that they owned an apartment. I ended up paying cash. It turns out that they didn't own that apartment. That apartment was owned by someone else completely. So I got scammed in that case. And there was one time where I was traveling from one city in Mexico to another city, and I forgot that I had left cash in my luggage, and the airport security opened up my luggage, stole all of my cash, and by the time I arrived in my next destination, I had no more cash on me for changing here in Mexico City, so that happened as well. And now for some bonus things to see in Mexico City. Check out the Venice-like canals of Mexico City by visiting Xochimilco. Here, load up on souvenirs and hop on a trajinera boat, which will take you through the canals. During your journey, buy drinks, more souvenirs, listen to traditional Mexican banda music, and watch as your trajinera traverses the traffic of hundreds of other trajineras. If you're lucky, once you hop off, visit the town of Xochimilco and you might randomly run into a festival. Grab an Uber to the north of central Mexico City and visit the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Head to the top of the hill for an amazing view of Mexico City and check out the museum cataloging the evolution of religion in Mexico. If you have a chance, check out one of many cemeteries within Mexico City, such as the Panteón Guadalupe Mixcoac. Appreciate the beautiful, detailed, and creative tombstones and mausoleums that Mexicans build to remember their loved ones. These style of cemeteries were brought to Mexico by the Spanish Catholic Empire many centuries ago. For a more family-oriented adventure, grab a taxi to the outskirt barrios of Mexico City and enter Los Dinamos Park. Here you can walk around and enjoy the festivities that Mexican families enjoy in the park, while walking through the natural reserves and forests in the area. After visiting Frida Kahlo's house, as well as Leon Trotsky's house in Coyoacán, grab a taxi to the Anahuacalli Museum for some beautiful ancient indigenous artifacts and history. Frida Kahlo's husband, Diego Rivera, spent his life's fortune on constructing this museum and housing its priceless artifacts and beautiful murals. For those interested to see the fanciest parts of Mexico City, visit Parque La Mexicana in Santa Fe. Here you'll be able to walk through a beautifully designed park overshadowed by towering sky blue condos. You won't believe that this park was only recently just a garbage dump. Curious to see what traditional Mexican antiques look like? Visit the Tianguis La Lagunilla, just a few blocks north of the center. Here you will find artifacts of Mexican culture from the early 1930s until today, all for sale. Want to see a bird's eye view of Mexico City from the heart of downtown? Take the elevator up the Torre Latinoamericana, both during the daytime and during the nighttime, to really understand the vastness of the Mexico City concrete jungle. And finally, visit the Palacio Nacional for their beautiful colonial-era architecture, gardens, and their historical museum inside. Here is where all the trials, tribulations, politics, discord, and drama happened over the centuries-long course of post-conquest Mexican history. So, I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope I covered as much as possible. There's at least a million more things that I could talk about Mexico City. And I hope you enjoyed that video. And I will see you in the next video. Leonidas, salute. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Also, feel free to leave a comment on what you liked most about my review of Mexico City, or even some things that I maybe missed about Mexico City. Cheers and salud.